What if a single night could wipe out 1,000 enemies without a single soldier marching, without a single speech, without mercy? No warning, no negotiation, just silence, strategy, and the sky. This is not fantasy. This is the night Burkina Faso stunned the world, and not a soul saw it coming. The story doesn't begin with explosions. It begins in the quiet, in shadows, in whispers. Long before the first drone ever took off, before a single bullet cracked through the air, Captain Ibrahim had already made his choice. Burkina Faso would not beg for survival. It would seize it. Foreign military bases, closed, and international aid, too many strings, too many men in suits who never stepped foot where the blood spilled. Captain Ibrahim didn't need more press conferences or promises. He needed something far more dangerous: information. In a land where neighbors could be enemies and ambushes could happen without warning, intelligence wasn't a luxury, it was survival. So he turned away from embassies and turned toward the fields, toward the villages, toward the people. And what he unlocked wasn't an army, it was something stronger, a network. They called it the Whisper War. It started with shepherds memorizing tire tracks, women counting motorbikes, children learning to listen for strange dialects and spotting fear behind quiet eyes. They weren't soldiers, but they were survivors, and they'd seen enough horror to recognize it when it passed their door. Captain Ibrahim's new forces gathered this intelligence not in foreign offices, but in dusty tents, around flickering screens, in hushed meetings under the cover of night. What they saw was chilling. Something was coming. Not just a strike, a movement, a convoy, winking, deliberate, growing in numbers, creeping silently through the Arbinda Corridor. Fighters, trucks, ammunition. This wasn't a raid, it was a mobile war machine, shifting through villages and vanishing into the bush like a serpent in tall grass. But this time they weren't invisible. High above, small drones, some no bigger than birds, circled in the clouds, hidden from sight, watching every curve the convoy took. Burkina Faso engineers had quietly upgraded them, not with outside contractors, but with local brains. Young minds, hungry minds, the kind who studied war not in textbooks, but in their backyards. And still, no strike, no panic, just patience, the deadliest weapon of all. For nearly 2 months, the military held back, letting the convoy grow, studying every vehicle, every man, every potential exit, until the moment came when the trap was perfect. Not a single escape route left unsealed, not a single ridge unmapped. The convoy believed it was cruising through familiar territory. In truth, they were driving into a kill zone so precise, so calculated, that every tree, every shadow had already been assigned a purpose. And then, without warning, the sky opened. The first missile came like a ghost, no sound, no blaze, just sudden, catastrophic silence. The lead truck, carrying a commander's and communications gear, exploded into a fireball. Not just random destruction, it was surgical. They had cut the head off the serpent. Seconds later, the tail vehicle burst into flames. The exit was gone. The convoy was boxed in. Panic swept the militants. Some reversed, others jumped out and ran. But there was nowhere to run. Every move had been predicted. Every mistake anticipated. They weren't in Burkina Faso anymore. They were inside a plan they never saw coming. And this was only the beginning. The moment the second drone cut through the sky, the convoy's fate was sealed. Vehicles slammed into each other. Gunmen shouted commands that nobody followed. Radios crackled, but no one answered. The insurgents were frozen, not by fear alone, but by disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not in a place where for years they had moved with impunity. But the truth was, this wasn't the same Burkina Faso anymore. The landscape hadn't changed, but the rules had. Captain Ibrahim's doctrine was built on something his enemies didn't understand: unity. Not the kind written into dusty constitutions, but the kind born from desperation and molded by fire. Farmers who had buried sons, traders who had been extorted, mothers who had fled burning homes. They weren't watching from the sidelines anymore. They were fighting back, and they were doing it smarter than any foreign trained army ever imagined. The intelligence didn't stop with movement patterns or vehicle counts. Informants sent word of supply caches buried near dry riverbeds, of secret trails used to bypass known checkpoints, of disguised fighters slipping into towns to recruit or to threaten. Every detail, no matter how small, was logged, cross-verified, and sent to the field. This wasn't guesswork, it was data, and it changed everything. For years, insurgents had used chaos as their weapon. They hid in the confusion, struck where eyes couldn't see. But now, those same shadows betrayed them. Drones saw through the trees, science, heat signatures lit up targets in the dead of night, and ground teams moved not just with force, but with foresight. Still, the trap wasn't complete without the men and women on the ground. That's where the VDP came in, the volunteers for the defense of the homeland. These weren't soldiers by training. They were barbers, teachers, taxi drivers. Ordinary people transformed into a disciplined fighting force under a single principle: protect what is ours. They trained fast, deployed faster, and on that night fought like men possessed, not out of duty, out of memory. Each of them had lost something: a family member, a village, a sense of safety. And that night, in the Arbinda Corridor, they got something back: control. While the drones pushed the convoy toward choke points, Cobra Commando units waited in silence, guns drawn, breathing steady. The order was simple: do not shoot until the signal comes. That signal wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a sound. It was a drone cutting its lights and hovering in place, still as death, right above the heart of the convoy. That was it. That was enough. From the tree line, snipers emerged like phantoms. One by one, high-value targets dropped before they could even raise a weapon. Radio operators, unit leaders, the few insurgents who had experience, gone within minutes. The rest scrambled, not knowing where to run or who to follow. That confusion was by design. Every movement of the ambush had been rehearsed. Every fire team knew its exact zone. Every sniper had memorized faces from surveillance photos taken weeks earlier. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only precision. And when the ground assault began, it wasn't a charge, it was a flood. Cobra Commandos came in from the north. Reinforcements flanked from the east. Helicopters poured down suppressive fire from above, slicing the darkness with tracer rounds and spotlights. The VDP came last, not to finish the job, but to seal it shut. Their role was not just to fight, but to remind the enemy who this land belonged to. In the middle of the chaos, one thing became painfully clear to the insurgents. They weren't facing a broken nation anymore. They were facing a movement, one with eyes in the sky, strength in the hills, and fire in the hearts of men who had waited too long for justice. By the fourth hour, resistance had collapsed. The remaining militants scattered into the bush. But even the bush betrayed them. Tripwires snapped, traps detonated, snipers took them down before they could disappear. Every path had been accounted for. Every possible exit led only to one thing: silence. And not a single Burkina Faso village was harmed. Not a single civilian casualty. That, too, was part of the plan. As dawn broke over the Arbinda Corridor, smoke curled into the pale sky. But this wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a message. 1,000 insurgents down. Dozens captured alive. No fanfare, no celebration, just confirmation. Burkina Faso had spoken, not through declarations, but through discipline. Not in headlines, but in results. The silence after the strike said more than any speech ever could. There were no parades, no politicians giving interviews, just calm voices transmitting the code word that the mission had succeeded. And then, just as quietly as it began, the forces pulled back. No looting, no shouting, only discipline. It was a warning to every warlord, every regional bandit, every sponsor of chaos who thought this country was still asleep. We're not asking anymore. We're acting. This night didn't just reset the battlefield. It rewrote it. Captain Ibrahim had proven that you don't need billions in military aid to defend your homeland. What you need is belief. Belief in your people, in your own tools, in your own map of the fight. Because this wasn't just about firepower. It was about foresight. It wasn't about how many bullets could be fired, but how few needed to be. And that's what made the operation in Arbinda so terrifying to its enemies. Not the force, the control. In the weeks that followed, radio chatter among militant groups shifted. Leaders whispered of betrayal, of their ranks being watched, studied. They blamed foreign powers, rival factions, even witchcraft. But the truth? It was a shepherd, a child, a volunteer, a drone. They hadn't been betrayed, they'd been outthought. For years, foreign observers had criticized African militaries for lack of coordination, for corruption, for being outdated. But what happened in Arbinda was different. This was fourth-generation warfare, real-time coordination between air, land, and intelligence. Pulled off by a landlocked West African nation many had dismissed as a security afterthought. And the technology? It wasn't borrowed. It was built, locally, quietly, efficiently. Captain Ibrahim didn't want toys from foreign arsenals. He wanted tools that made sense on his terrain. Drones built for the bush, not for parades. Surveillance systems that ran on solar power, not promises. Interfaces simple enough for volunteers, strong enough for commandos. It worked. And now the rest of the world had to decide how to respond. Some would cheer, others would fear. Because when a nation once considered weak suddenly becomes capable, it forces uncomfortable questions. Who else might follow? What alliances were quietly formed? And most of all, what else is possible when Africa stops asking for permission? While others measured power in tanks and boots, Captain Ibrahim looked upward. He saw war not as a matter of muscle, but of sight. In his eyes, the most important soldiers didn't march. They hovered. Burkina Faso's drone revolution didn't begin in foreign hangars. It started in forgotten basements, in rural workshops, in cafes where young minds sketched diagrams on napkins and trained themselves in secret. No consultants, no high-priced foreign trainers, just curiosity and necessity. Captain Ibrahim gave them the one thing they had never had before: trust. He said, "Build what we need, ignore what the world sells." So they did. Some drones flew high, scanning heat patterns across valleys. Others buzzed low, mapping enemy paths and identifying makeshift camps before a single militant even lit a fire. But the game changer, the true jewel of the fleet, was the micro-drone. No bigger than a bird, silent as a falling leaf, it could slip under canopies, drift near campfires, hover for hours. And when it returned, it brought more than images. It brought understanding. It gave Burkina Faso not just intelligence, but time. Time to plan, time to wait, time to strike. But Ibrahim didn't stop at machines. He reshaped the minds that used them. Platoons were retrained to think like drone operators, to move only when visual confirmation was clear, to hold until coordinates aligned in. Even VDP volunteers, who once lacked radios, were handed simple drone apps on rugged tablets. Suddenly, every man in the field wasn't just a fighter, he was a sensor. The battlefield wasn't just physical anymore, it was digital, and it worked. Insurgents couldn't breathe without being noticed. Camps that took days to build were bombed within hours. Convoys broke apart before reaching their destination. From the sky, the enemy looked large. From the drones, they looked predictable. The result? Chaos. On the insurgent side, paranoia festered. They questioned each other. They doubted their own scouts. They called for help and found silence. Some fled before a shot was fired, believing ghosts were watching. But there were no ghosts, just algorithms, calculations, vision. And for the first time in its history, Burkina Faso was not reacting to war. It was forecasting it. This wasn't a lucky break. It was doctrine. And it worked because it was tailored not to Western war theaters or Cold War playbooks, but to dusty roads and savanna winds. To regions where the only cover is a lone tree and the only chance is to strike first, and strike they did. But even as the operations grew more effective, the cost became clear. Because this kind of coordination, this kind of clarity, doesn't come cheap, not in dollars but in discipline. In the days after Arbinda, the footage spread, not through newspapers or newsrooms, but through whispers. Cell phone videos, grainy clips passed over WhatsApp. The message was the same: we are not who you thought we were. Across dusty towns and aging radios, the people watched in stunned silence. Some cried, some prayed, others simply nodded, for they already knew what the world was just discovering. Burkina Faso had changed, but with success came expectation. The people, once passive, were now alert, no longer hoping, but demanding. If the military could stop 1,000 militants overnight, why not stop the next attack too? Why not intercept the next ambush? Where once they had asked, "Can we defend ourselves?" Now they asked, "Why didn't we?" That's the curse of victory. It raises the floor as much as the ceiling. Captain Ibrahim understood this. He knew the battle wasn't just in corridors. It was in hearts, in homes, in the long stretches of silence that follow gunfire. And the truth was, no matter how precise the strike, no matter how brilliant the ambush, wars like this wear people down. Soldiers may be fearless, but they're not tireless. Volunteers may be passionate, but they're not machines. Drones may fly for hours, but even they need updates, repairs, and hands to guide them. The system had worked, yes, but could it last? Sustainability became the next battlefront. Surveillance networks needed constant feeding, new intel, new contacts, fresh eyes. Fuel had to be delivered, solar panels maintained, servers secured. One small gap, one bad day, and the whole chain could collapse. And worse, the enemy wasn't done. Insurgent groups began adapting, splitting into smaller units, shifting routes, avoiding patterns. Some crossed into neighboring states where Burkina's influence faded. Others changed dress, language, even tactics. If Ibrahim's forces were a sword, the enemy became smoke, and smoke is hard to fight. Meanwhile, politics stirred. Ibrahim's popularity soared, but admiration doesn't fix power lines or rebuild schools. The people didn't just want safety, they wanted dignity, water, clinics, jobs. Not just a break from terror, but a return to life. So the military rolled up its sleeves again, this time not to fight, but to build. Soldiers were dispatched to villages, not with guns, but with shovels. They cleared roads, repaired wells, helped markets reopen. And yet, the shadow of war lingered. Every new attack, no matter how small, echoed louder than before. Each tragedy felt like a betrayal of the hope Arbinda had sparked. And that's the danger of greatness. It makes anything less feel like failure. Beyond its borders, Burkina Faso's new posture sent ripples. Some allies smiled, others frowned. The West, once its patron, now watched cautiously. Sanctions had not stopped this transformation. Isolation had not prevented this awakening. And that, more than the drones, was what unsettled them most. Because now the question had changed. Not how did they pull this off, but who helped them? Speculation ran wild. Some whispered of new Eastern partners, of technology transfers, of quiet pacts struck without Western approval. Others asked harder questions. What if other African nations follow this model? What if sovereignty without strings becomes contagious? To some, that idea was inspiring. To others, it was dangerous. Burkina Faso was no longer a story of suffering. It was becoming a blueprint, a precedent, a mirror that showed what could happen when a nation stops waiting and starts building. But mirrors reflect both pride and threat. And Ibrahim knew that with every success, every step towards self-determination, new enemies would emerge. Some in the bush, some in boardrooms. The insurgents may have lost the corridor, but ideologies don't die from drone strikes. They mutate, they hide, they wait. And the next battles may not look like the last. They may come dressed as economic pressure, as cyber intrusions, as foreign-backed crisis resolution teams. But if Ibrahim feared that, he didn't show it. He continued investing in what couldn't be bought, belief. He told his people, "We cannot wait for peace to be delivered. We must deliver it ourselves." And the people listened, not because he was loud, but because he was right. Burkina Faso was no longer asking the world for approval. It was asking its people for patience, and offering something the region had rarely seen. Not just hope, but proof. To fight is one thing, to rebuild is another. And while the world stared at Burkina Faso's battlefield brilliance, Captain Ibrahim turned his gaze somewhere harder, toward what comes after the smoke clears. You see, true sovereignty isn't just declared with drones and ambushes. It's secured with roads that don't collapse, with schools where children learn without fear, with clinics that have more medicine than bullet holes. That's where the real war lives, not in combat, but in consistency. Ibrahim understood this truth better than most. Victory on the field meant little if mothers still walked miles for water, if a child could recite the sound of gunfire, but not the alphabet. And so he ordered his military to do something rarely asked of them: lay down their rifles and pick up their tools. Soldiers began digging trenches, not for cover, but for irrigation. They helped reconstruct bridges that connected forgotten villages. VDP units, once trained in ambush strategy, were now repairing market stalls and distributing food. But not everyone cheered. To some, this felt strange, even wrong. A military is for fighting, they said, not farming. But Ibrahim rejected that thinking. If we only fight, he said, we will keep fighting forever. His goal wasn't just to win wars, it was to prevent them from returning. Because he knew what others often forget: insurgencies don't rise from strength, they rise from absence. From the vacuum left when no doctor comes, when no teacher arrives, when no one believes their government remembers their name. So he made remembering a mission. He sent commanders to speak with village elders, not as rulers, but as listeners. He reopened roads where ambulances hadn't passed in years. He brought light to towns that had only known candles and silence. And slowly, something even more powerful than fear began to return: trust. This trust, fragile as it was, became his real battlefield. Because you can bomb a convoy in one night, but to build trust, that takes years. One broken promise can ruin what 1,000 victories can't restore. That's why the hardest part of this revolution wasn't strategy, it was patience. Holding the line not just against militants, but against cynicism, against old habits, against the slow, grinding weight of decades of disappointment. But still, the work continued. Because to Captain Ibrahim, the most important weapon in the fight for a nation's soul wasn't the drone in the sky, it was the dignity on the ground. From Washington to Paris, analysts rewound the footage from Arbinda again and again. Experts debated strategies, generals took notes. Editorials praised and panicked in equal measure. How, they asked, did a small, under-resourced nation execute what richer armies still struggled to accomplish? But the real story wasn't in the tactics, it was in the transformation. Burkina Faso had gone from being watched to doing the watching. For decades, outside powers had monitored the Sahel, from satellites, consulates, and command centers in foreign capitals. They offered advice, sometimes troops, mostly conditions. But what Arbinda revealed was simple and seismic. Africa no longer needed permission to lead. That truth made some uneasy, because if one nation could build a local intelligence network, train civilian volunteers, develop native drone programs, and execute a flawless ambush without international oversight, what stopped others? That's the power of precedent. And Ibrahim knew it. He knew that after Arbinda, every success and every failure would echo louder. Every decision scrutinized, every alliance questioned. He had walked onto the global stage not by invitation, but by action. But being seen is not the same as being supported. Though the mission had shocked insurgents, it had also unsettled those who benefited from an Africa in crisis. For if Africa could defend itself, who then would justify their presence? Their programs? Their profits? This is the quiet war that followed the loud one. A war of narratives, of influence, of shaping perception, where headlines are weapons and silence is strategy. But Ibrahim's answer was clear. Keep moving, keep building, keep winning the trust of those who matter most. Not boardrooms, not broadcast networks, but the people living between the rivers and the dust. The real observers weren't watching from afar. They were watching from porches, market stalls, school benches. And they weren't counting drone strikes. They were counting the days since their last funeral. That's who this revolution was for, and that's who made it real. When the dust finally settled and the last echo of gunfire faded from the Arbinda Corridor, a new question emerged. Not just for Captain Ibrahim, but for every Burkinabe. Now what? Because the battle had been won, yes, but the war was never just about bullets. It was about belonging. And now the people, awake and expectant, would accept nothing less than the full return of their nation. Ibrahim knew that history forgets the loud and remembers the lasting. And so he moved with a quiet resolve, investing in roads and energy, yes, but also in voices, in creating space for communities to speak, to organize, to rise, not through rebellion, but through restoration. This is what makes the Burkina Faso model different. It is not just a military model, it's a civic one. It says, we fight not to rule, but to rebuild. And that's the hardest model of all, because it's slow, it's invisible, it's unglamorous, but it's what turns a victory into a legacy. So now, as other nations take note, as insurgents regroup and diplomats whisper, the question returns, not to the general, but to the people. Will you carry this forward? Will you demand not just safety, but dignity? Because the war for sovereignty is no longer about borders. It's about purpose, identity, memory. And for once, the world isn't asking what Burkina Faso lacks, but what it has found. The answer? Clarity, confidence, control. And if Captain Ibrahim's path proves anything, it's this. Africa does not need permission to rise. It never did. It just needed the moment, and now that moment has come.